Okay, guys, what is up? Time for part two of this week. This should be shorter, but let's jump right in. So, to be clear, rival states, you're going to want to know this for midterms, are Cuba because of its communism and proximity and Florida voters, Venezuela because of socialism and oil, North Korea, isolation and nukes, also the containment of Chinese influence. The others are China because of manufacturing independence, Russia because of invasions and even more invasions, Iran, lack of cooperation with the rest of the Middle East. But because we're talking about the Middle East today, we'll have a chance to get more into that. Today we're finishing the spheres of influence. So yesterday or Tuesday was Africa, Europe, North America, South America. Today's far more ambitious actually because we're doing Asia, the Middle East, Antarctica, and outer space. And interesting enough, if you look at India, China, Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, we're going over some of the most populous states in the world. Um, so, very important. So, first part of Asia we're going to do is East Asia. So, that would be China, plus or minus Taiwan, you know, depending on how you feel about that issue. Japan, which we'll be focusing the most on since we covered China. North and South Korea, we already covered that with the Korean War. Mongolia, not a super pressing U.S. foreign policy concern. So China, or East Asia, is everything we see here, mainly within the orbit of China. Other than geography, uh, basically all of these except Mongolia have some sort of basis in Confucian culture as well. So while Confucius was from China, Koreans, Japanese, Taiwanese would consider themselves Chinese, it doesn't matter, all have some sort of philosophical and moral lineage to Confucius. And at first, this will seem pretty reductive. We're going to be talking about the first or last remaining big power in East Asia that we haven't discussed yet, being Japan. And that really starts with this whole idea of samurai culture, which, like I said, at first seems very reductive. We wouldn't talk about like chivalry to explain British politics, or we wouldn't talk about cowboys to talk about American politics. But this warrior culture, especially putting the entire country before one's own needs, does have a more modern flavor, iteration, however you want to say it, in this idea of Japan in World War II having this radical nationalistic dedication. And by nationalistic, I mean hard love of Japan, which is, one thing, but then a complete distaste of anyone who's not Japanese. And so within the Japanese zeitgeist, that turned into this permission structure to allow for invasions of different areas. In not only invasions of different areas, but some of the most dedicated, hardcore fighters, like what you would see in sort of romanticized stories about samurai. And of course, real samurai weren't like that most of the time, but the Japanese in the 1930s and 40s didn't know. But rolling into all these different invasions of Asia, of course, there's the bombing on Pearl Harbor, invasion of the Philippines. Within East Asia, though, what's probably the most infamous is the massacre at Nanjing. I'm not going to say the R word that it's normally associated with. You probably know what it is. But this is about 200,000 people on the high end, 100,000 on the low end, people in Nanjing massacred by a Japanese invasion. Nanjing being in China. Um, Overall, though, it's part of this whole pattern of Japan coming out of the island and attacking other countries because of this whole superiority idea. Um, and this whole idea of Japanese superiority gelled very well with the German idea of German superiority. So that's where you can see where a lot of the alliance between the two came. Nanjing is especially an important city within China, though. Um, the capital of China, Beijing, translates to North Capital. Bei being north, Jing being capital. Nanjing translates to South Capital. So some would say it's the second most important city in China. Um, Others would say it's probably Shanghai. But culturally, Nanjing is super important, and it had a very big population that the Japanese eviscerated. Now, when we talk about how bad the massacre, not the other word, but the massacre of Nanjing was, like with slavery in the last class, we don't really give it its due. And no matter what you hear, it seems like there's always something more messed up. Um, One of the more famous ones is this contest between these two swordsmen to see who could have the best volume and technique in decapitating the most people. And as you can see here, the score was 106 to 105 people decapitated. Um, but yeah, like I said, other parts of the attack on Nanjing were so graphic and so violent that I just, for the sake of my own job and the sake of your own well-being, I'm just not comfortable going into. If you want to learn more about it, I would exercise caution, and we'll leave it at that. But in current day China, the most offensive slur within Chinese is directed only at the Japanese. I'm not going to say it, I'm not going to translate it, but even in modern day Chinese, it's the most offensive thing you can possibly say is only directed at the Japanese in sort of grievance for what happened in Nanjing. Like I talked about, these are some of the biggest populations in the world. So when an invasion, a famine, or a famine caused by an invasion hits, it causes just absolute bedlam. Um, so many deaths that, especially in the West, we really have a tough time wrapping our minds around. But Japanese invasion of all of Asia, especially China, um, one of the darkest moments in human history. And I had made the comparison between Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. In Nazi Germany, they had the testing on different Jewish people, especially twins, because what it was ostensibly, or what they said it was for scientific research. Turns out that basically no discoveries were made, and it was just an excuse to torture people. And Japan had a very similar program with their Unit 731. So, as the war is coming to an end, Japan isn't doing well, um, but they're not giving up. People aren't retreating; they're choosing suicide over retreat and stuff like that. Fighting to the absolute bitter end, even when they don't have to, because of this nationalistic and frankly racist belief that they're better than other people. And that's really brought into the calculation that should America do a land invasion of mainland Japan or drop the nuclear bombs? And not an easy decision, but if you saw Oppenheimer or went to high school, you probably know how this ends. Um, Two nuclear bombs dropped on Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The thing is the Japanese didn't know how many other nuclear weapons the United States had. Turns out the answer to that was zero. But in an effort to not only preserve people but heritage sites, Japan had an unconditional surrender. Um, yeah, uh, Speaking of heritage sites, the United States specifically chose two places that didn't have a ton of Japanese heritage because they knew that this would be a factor. But yeah, Japan's unconditional surrender, seen as a massive embarrassment um, to the Japanese, not necessarily blaming their government, but a lot of internal shame that farmers at home growing food didn't grow food hard enough and stuff like that. So it's a very personal felt loss at the time. And of course, there's a plan to partition Japan. Um, Eventually, the United States gets entire control over it, and it kicks off this part of Japanese history called the American occupation, which in some ways is still technically going on today. Japan's not really allowed to have a military beyond the JDF, or Japanese Defense Force, with the understanding that the United States will build all these bases in Japan and act as its own defense in case of invasion. Now, if you're manipulative enough, you can get people to feel very strongly about any old grievance. Um, a great example being these historic Russian borders we always hear about. The thing, though, is with all the war crimes that Japan did in all these different places, only to then lose, there are a lot of modern grievances against Japan. Lesser in China, more in Korea. One of the more talked about grievances is this whole practice of comfort women. And you can probably tell where this is about to go. But it was the practice of local Chinese and Korean women being brought into sexual servitude for occupying Japanese forces, especially officers. And no, it's not consensual, it's sexual servitude. So obviously you can see where the grievance comes from in this, and it still persists today. Famously, the Japanese president Abe Shinzo, Abe being the family name, um, was very adamant in refusing to apologize for this practice that Japan did during the wars, making him, and by extension most of Japan, very unpopular among East Asia during his term. It's believed, or at least claimed, that some of the memorials for the comfort women, one of the people apologizing for it was Abe Shinzo, or made to look like Abe Shinzo, even though it's never 100% been confirmed, as far as I know. So, to get an idea of how complicated things are in East Asia, Taiwan and China are seen as a country split in two over communist capitalist disputes. Same with North and South Korea. And Japan's not allowed to have a military other than the JDF, and the JDF is not that powerful. Furthermore, Taiwan has only these states that recognize it as an independent country. If you look pretty closely, you'll recognize that the United States is not actually recognized Taiwan as an independent country. And once again, this is partially due to the strategic ambiguity policy. We're not going to fully support or reject Taiwan because the ambiguity works for the United States the best. Going back into how complicated this is, South Korea generally likes the USA, um, even if not the government and sometimes the people. They like the protection it provides. Japan likes the USA, more or less, because of the protection it provides. And China's a rival to the USA. So you would think my friend's enemy is also my enemy, but that's not really the case, because everyone trades with China, especially South Korea. Without China, the South Korean economy is even more evaporated than the U.S. economy. And China and South Korea both have a ton of grievance with Japan because of Japan's war crimes. So it's an absolute mess or tangled web of how politics in East Asia works. But like we talked about, you can see Abe Shinzo crossing his arms in this alongside Trump against Europe. So there has been this pivot to the east that the United States is trying to capitalize on. Now, if I can be a little frank, but I think Japan's main issue is all the dorky white guys who are a little too obsessed with Japanese culture. Um, Not that I would know anything about that. Okay, moving on, we got Southeast Asia. So that's all the states you see here. Frankly, there's not a lot to go over because the US doesn't pay a ton of attention to this part of the world. But the major concerns with Southeast Asia are keep the trade flowing and keep them aligned with containing China. I don't want to give the impression that because it's not a huge area of concern for the United States that it's not important. Um, I don't know if you've ever seen this chart before, but within this blue circle lives half of the human population. So critical importance, just not necessarily on the US's radar. Now, this is specifically for liquid natural gas or LNG, but it's a good indicator of just how much trade goes through this corridor called the South China Sea and how important the Spratly Islands are too, especially to China and the Nine Dash Line. So keeping this open for free trade is a major concern basically for everybody, but it only takes a few people to mess it up. Now the other one, and this is pretty outdated, it's 2018, but we'll get to why I still use it anyway. It's the best looking graphic, despite being so old, and simply basically as any of these graphics come out, they're out of date because the positions change so much, especially for the green states. I would say the biggest change for this has been Philippines are a bit more blue nowadays. And India is actually, since COVID and the invasion of Ukraine, has actually been cooperating more with Russia. So that would bring it more into the green because Russia and China cooperate a bit too. And if anyone is familiar with this woman, you'll know that this region is also very unstable. So this is a woman, I believe 2021 in Myanmar, who during COVID lockdowns, she was leading an exercise class, or calisthenics, aerobics, I'm not sure what the differences are. But you're supposed to dance along with her to stay fit while you're stuck indoors. And in the background of your video, you see these military and police cars going through. And that was a coup for Myanmar going on in the middle of this video, which became a meme because of her dance music was very upbeat and she didn't seem to know what was going on. That being said, there has been an alleged genocide in Myanmar of the Rohingya people. And then in Indonesia in the 60s and 70s, because of the Cold War, there was a genocide heavily backed by the United States. Like I said, we don't have enough time to go into everything, but I strongly recommend, if you have the Constitution for it, I strongly recommend watching the movie The Act of Killing. This documentary crew is able to get some of the quote-unquote heroes of this genocide to just flat out admit and reenact what they did. So it's not an easy watch, but it's important in its own way. Even more so to a degree with Southeast Asia is Oceania. I'm kind of lumping in with Southeast Asia, even though it is something entirely different. But due to the relatively low population and strong alignment with the United States because of Australia and New Zealand, Oceania is generally a pretty chill place. Um, Really just a matter of bases controlling the Pacific. All right, so on to South Asia, which is all the countries or states you see in orange here. Big one being the partition between Pakistan and India after the British left. Um, we'll get into this, especially with the Middle East, but there's this issue of nations or how people identify within themselves and states or how the government sets its borders not aligning. And so because of that, there's Indian claims in Pakistan, Pakistani claims in India, and then there's East Pakistan or Bangladesh as of 1971 that creates this whole other complicating issue. Main thing being is that because of all this, they've built up a lot of grievance over the years through ethnic, religious, territorial claims, and historically the governments don't like each other. No, basically all my Indian friends know Pakistani people that they like, and vice versa. It's more of a government thing, but the people on the street aren't the ones with weapons. It's the government that gives them the weapons. One of the more visible illustrations of this is the border ceremony. I believe this is daily, but Pakistan and India, the border between will have this very big, some would say over the top, peacocking ceremony to show how tough they are. It's a lot of literally stomping feet. And I don't mean to downplay it, it's a very cool looking ceremony. Well, how are the people of India and Pakistan getting over this border dispute? Well, mainly by getting older and dying, um, which is, some would say, one of the more constructive ways. But there have been flare ups from time to time. At May of last year, there was a terrorist attack that set off a domino effect that led to engagement between India and Pakistan. I remember getting on a flight and everything being fine, and then getting off the flight, and my Indian colleague had told me that this had happened, and it was very concerning, especially because there aren't many nations or states with nuclear weapons, but India and Pakistan are two of them, and they, like I said, have all these big flare-ups. So, in terms of like threat of nuclear war leading to mutual assured destruction, it's a very concerning development. Now, internally, India, especially since the war in Ukraine, has had this relationship with Russia to where they're able to do roundabout deals with them, most famously oil. Uh, Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia sells a lot of oil. A lot of countries are refusing to buy Russian oil. India has no loyalty to Ukraine. So India is willing to buy Russian oil at a very low price, act as a middleman, and sell it for a large price, or at least a larger price. So a very common criticism of the Biden administration during the early days of the war and the Trump administration now is that sanctions on Russia really just artificially increase the price of oil and make middlemen in India very wealthy. Now, Pakistan has its own issues, especially with the United States. 2011, before 2011, as a kid, as I was told, Afghanistan is the bad one, Pakistan is the good one. Very reductive, I know, but that's what I was, at least within the American zeitgeist, that's how people felt. Pakistan was our ally. 2011, it turns out that Osama bin Laden had been hiding out in Pakistan within a few miles of Pakistan's main military academy. given that Pakistan is known to have serious problems with corruption, it was pretty widely accepted that Pakistan must have known something about where bin Laden was hiding. And there was a very big trust deficit between Pakistan and the United States because of this. In more recent years, because of China's One Belt, One Road policy, China has to develop Pakistan's infrastructure, and they've determined that it's better to do that by being friendly with Pakistan, um, which of course pushes India more into being friendly with the United States. But lately, especially since 2011, Pakistan has been growing more and more closely aligned with China. Now, people normally don't think of Afghanistan as South Asia. Other people would say it is. Um, we're going to say it is just to keep things flowing. We're familiar with the buildup of troops in Afghanistan through Bush, then Obama, then Trump, then Biden. Of course, early into his presidency, Biden pulls out of Afghanistan, causing this whole debacle. What's more interesting about Afghanistan, I think, has been what's going on since then. Because former terrorists or freedom fighters, depending on what you want to call them, have had to leave the fields, have had to leave open combat, come into government, and actually learn how to govern. And it's turned into this weird situation where you have a bunch of former terrorists who are being asked questions about municipal policy. So it's become this very strange situation where they're trying to learn how to govern themselves. Okay, South Asia was a little complicated. So is East Asia, Southeast Asia also. But let's go to a place that is famously never been that complicated, and that is the Middle East, sometimes known as West Asia. So what the Middle East is now is mostly a result of the legacy of the fall of the Ottoman Empire, which kind of like how the Soviet Union became Russia, you can think of the Ottoman Empire as what became Turkey. And that's not to say that within the Middle East there haven't been controlling, colonizing powers also getting involved in it. So losing the unity that came with the Ottoman Empire, a lot of the Middle East was divided into the states we see today by these foreign powers that really didn't understand how important nationalism, being ethnic groups, tribal groups, or whatever, was to the people of the Middle East. And so you have these maps. You can see here that like Arabs are cut up into a bunch of different places. Other states have like weird mixes of different ethnic groups. So a lot of people feel more allegiance to people just across the border and have control over their regions. So especially with the Kurds, it creates this very unfortunate situation. Saudi Arabia is kind of the center of orbit around a lot of the Middle East. Not only do they control the two most holy cities within Muslim culture, Mecca and Medina, it's one of the largest Arab populations in the world and a lot of oil exports. So a lot of people are very friendly to Saudi Arabia, as you can see in this picture. In this meme that was based off the picture. Saudi Arabia's had a long-standing, some would say genocide, others would say invasion of Yemen, this country right here. So what issue does anybody have with Yemen? Well, we'll jump into that. Like you saw on the map below, Yemen is geographically very close to Somalia, so it has the same advantage in shutting down, well, not shutting down, but all the ships going through that. So early 2020s, Yemeni pirates were a very big concern, mostly led by a group called Houthis, which are they're Yemeni people, but they are Shia Muslim, meaning that they have more in common with Iran than Saudi Arabia. So Iran would fund a lot of them to attacking ships and disrupting international trade. Okay, let's talk about the Levant, and hopefully I still have a job at the end of this. So we've discussed, and there's no reason to get back into what an absolute mess the Syrian civil war is. Russian-backed groups, United States-backed groups, Taliban-backed groups, and sometimes they'll work together, sometimes they'll work apart. So Syria, kind of like Somalia, is just sort of in complete bedlam. Israel and Palestine both have historic claims to this specific region of the world, which is important, especially in all three Abrahamic religions. That would be Muslim, Jewish, and Christian. Israel's main force in the land is highly elite but low in number, the IDF, or Israeli Defense Force, which gets a lot of funding from the United States government. Now, within Palestine, there's a more diplomatic wing called the PA, or Palestinian Authority, which aren't seen to do a lot. Some people recognize them as the power within Palestine. Israel and the United States tend to look at the main power in Palestine being Hamas, which is this group. Generally, they're the more numerous than the IDF, but more poorly armed. And not necessarily Israeli or Palestinian, but just up north in Lebanon is this group called the Hezbollah, which is sort of a big stopgap between the two. They're pretty numerous and pretty well armed, so they're big trouble for Israel if they ever get involved, but they're more hesitant to get involved. That being said, they are funded by, can you take a guess who funds this group? That's right, Iran. And Hezbollah's focus isn't as much defend Lebanon as it is attack Israel. And so to have such an anti-Israeli group just looking for attack, basically, whenever they get an excuse, is a major concern for Israeli security. Now, it's not really a common denominator, but one of the big issues of instability in the Middle East is Iran. Because of Iran backing Hezbollah, they have a threat to Israel. And because they're backing of the Houthi rebels, they have a big threat to global shipping. So, of course, last year there were bombings of Tel Aviv from Iran. But what they've become very proficient in is drone warfare. And there was a situation last year, the year before, where a bunch of US soldiers are in Jordan, which is supposedly a neutral country, but between Iran and Israel, drones are coming in, they're meant to be blown up, but the systems fail on the US side, and the drones are able to get through and kill these three service people. Part of the retaliation for this and overall Iranian aggression last year was Operation Midnight Hammer, or the United States bombing Iran to prevent nuclear buildup also. Anyway, that's all you ever need to know about the Middle East. I'm joking, of course. We'll touch back on it as the semester goes on. But let's talk about Antarctica. And if I'm being real, if I'm being, as the kids these days say, dead ass, this is actually a pretty good visual of what Antarctica policy is like. And it all sort of revolves around the South Pole. So for Antarctica, no single state owns it as of a treaty signed in 1959 that was made effective in 1961. Um, this almost unilateral international treaty says it's not allowed for military or nuclear waste use, really just science. So you're not supposed to bring weapons, or at least military weapons there. Um, More like chemistry kits. Mining is banned. I don't know how you would mine under all that ice, but in case you figure out a way you're not allowed to do it to protect the nature there. And then balance is maintained through meetings. So sometimes they'll have issues with each other, have a periodic meeting, all the different states occupying Antarctica. They'll have a meeting and work out issues there. And I don't mean to dunk on Katy Perry in 2 lectures in a row, but let's talk about space. So outer space and the moon, we'll say, like Antarctica, no one owns space or the moon. It's seen as common heritage. States are responsible for their private companies. So if Jeff Bezos's satellites or Elon Musk satellites were to crash into a bunch of satellites from other states, then it would be up to the United States to resolve that issue with whatever state had the damage done to it. But mining is actually not banned. If you can figure out a way to do it, it's a market waiting to be tapped, if you'll excuse the pun. Okay, so we will leave it there. Just in case you weren't aware, midterm launches tonight. You'll have a little bit more than a week to complete it. That's 40 questions for 20% of your grade. Open book, open note, open internet, just like in real life. No AI. And also, just like real life, you have one shot at it. So, best of luck with it. Yeah, see ya.